Lavender is a wonderful perennial with magnificent fragrance and attractive blue foliage. It is native to the Mediterranean, and because it is native to the Mediterranean, it loves dry conditions. Today we are going to see how you can grow your own lavender from seed. So let's get started. Right here I have with me two different varieties of lavender. I have the Munstead type lavender and the Elegance purple lavender. I'm going to be planting these two different varieties in two different areas of our garden, and I want to test them to see which one does better in our conditions, because we do have pretty wet conditions and lavender does not like severe moisture. It likes to dry out between waterings. The lavender that I originally had did not do super well for me. It lived for several years, but it eventually gave up on life. So we're going to be trying out these two different varieties. I have this container over here that I will be mixing my soil in. And I also have some black gold potting mix. Because lavender likes dry conditions, even though we are starting it from seed, I'm not going to be using a seed starting mix, because the seed starting mix tends to hold on to moisture a lot more than potting soil does. And I chose this potting soil specifically because I noticed that this type of potting soil tends to dry out faster than some other potting soils that I have used. And because it dries out faster, it's going to prevent the lavender from rotting. And that is super essential because, as we have just mentioned, that lavender does not like to sit in moist soil. Even though it is just a seedling and it does require moisture, once that seedling starts putting on roots, then it is going to be susceptible to rot. That's why we're going to be using this potting mix. When you are choosing your potting mix, try to choose one that does not hold on to too much moisture. And if it does, if that's the only potting mix that you have, you can add some perlite to it, and that's going to help it with drainage. Let's go ahead and add this potting mix over here. One thing to note when you are starting plants from seed is that you want to moisten your medium first before you plant the seeds in it. And the reason for that is because if your soil was too dry, it will become hydrophobic. What that means is that it will repel any water that touches it. So you will see that the water will just sit there on the surface of the soil and it will not get absorbed into the soil. It might eventually get absorbed, but that will take days. From my experience, that's how it is. So I got some warm water over here, and I'm going to be adding it into the soil. And then you want to agitate the soil to allow it to begin to absorb the water. I think I put too much soil in here. When you're done mixing it, you want to end up with something like this, where it holds on to its shape when you press it together. And when you let it go, it crumbles up. And when you squeeze it, it does not squeeze out liquid out of it or water out of it. So this is the perfect consistency right here. And over here I have these cell trays, seed starting trays, and each of them has 24 cells in it. These have trays that come with them that hold onto the water so that you can put the water into the tray in order to water your seedlings. I forgot to get them. They're in storage right now. And they also come with this platform and a wicking mat. This wicking mat, you place it on top of this platform, and the edges of the wicking mat go into the tray and they wick the water onto the wicking mat over here. The cell tray then sits onto the wicking mat and receives the water from the wicking mat. Right now we just have these cell trays over here because I forgot to get the actual trays that they sit in. So we are going to fill the cell trays with some soil. And you want to use soil that does not have fertilizer in it. And we will talk a little more about that in a little bit. As you fill the tray, you want to press down gently on the soil that's in the cells to make sure that the cell is completely full and there are no air gaps. Because as I push down, some of them have air gaps, and the roots would not be able to grow well in this way. And if you see any large pieces in the soil, just take them out. Sometimes there's bark. So on these packets, it requires the lavender to be covered about 1/8 of an inch of soil. That's very little soil. Lavender seeds also require light to germinate. But before we even get there, there's one very important thing that you need to know about a lavender when you are starting it from seed. And that is called stratification. So what does that mean, stratification? Basically, it's just allowing the seeds to go through a cold period. You can do that in two different methods. You can either put your seeds in the fridge, as I have done. I just stuck these seed packets into the fridge and I left them there until I was ready to plant. They don't need to sit there for that long. They need to sit for about 6 weeks or so in the fridge in order to get that stratification period. The second method of stratification that you can use is winter sowing. And I have done several videos on winter sowing. I'll link them for you in the description box below so that you can go ahead and check them out. But what winter sowing is basically is just planting your plants or your seeds in milk containers or water containers basically that are transparent, that allow the light to come in. And these act like mini greenhouses, and they bring in warmth enough for these seedlings to grow, but they also allow the seedlings to go through that stratification period. There's also a lot of snow and moisture that goes into these containers that the plants will be receiving. Now, if you live in a dry environment, you might want to give your seedlings some supplemental watering so that they can receive the adequate moisture that they need. However, I have found that when it comes to seeds that require to be surface sown, that this method does not work very well because the seeds can dry out at any moment and you have to check on them often so that these seeds don't dry out. Because once the seedlings enter the germination period, what happens is if the moisture is cut off of them and they are allowed to dry, the seeds would die and they will not germinate. So you have to be consistent at checking on them and watering them, making sure the soil is not dry. You also don't want to overwater them because you don't want the seeds to rot. And once the plants germinate, you also don't want to overwater them because you don't want the plants to germinate. So there's this tricky balance that can happen, especially with surface sown seeds. We're going to first start with the Elegance Purple Lavender. I don't have a lot of seeds in here. I thought that I'm going to have a lot more. So I'm going to be planting one seed in each cell and hopefully I'll have enough seeds. It looks like I barely have any seeds. So we're just going to place the seed at the surface and press it into the soil gently. And the seeds are pretty small, but they are manageable. If I notice that some of the cells are not germinating, then I can come with some more seeds and replace those seeds that did not germinate. If you are planning on growing this outside, you want to start it about 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. I'm starting this way before our last frost date, and that's because I want these plants to put on some growth before I plant them outdoors, because they're going to be tiny and they're just going to disappear in the landscape, and I want to look at something after I plant it and not try to find it with a microscope. So it looks like I have a few extra seeds. I'm going to save these just in case if some of these seedlings did not germinate. And I forgot my labels. I'm going to leave this on top of it. We're not done with this one actually. There's one more step, and that is vermiculite. So we are going to cover the surface of this cell tray with some vermiculite. And what vermiculite is going to do is it's going to regulate the moisture and not allow the seedlings to dry out. And it also will allow the light to penetrate through it, which is what these seedlings need in order to germinate. So it will make watering much easier, and we won't have to worry so much about the seedlings drying out. You just want a very thin layer of vermiculite. And also vermiculite is going to stop algae growth and mold, so it is very helpful. I haven't really used vermiculite much, but I just started using it recently. I had to do some research on it before I decided to use it, because I wanted to know where is the origin of vermiculite? Where does it originate from? Is it a chemical compound? Because I did not want to be putting chemicals in my soil, because I plant a lot of seeds and I don't want all these seeds to be covered with chemicals and then that chemical ending up in the soil. But vermiculite is actually derived from volcanic rock. That gives me some comfort knowing that it's actually beneficial and not harmful. Now, after planting them, I usually like to mist them. I don't have my mister with me, but the misting just kind of sets the seed into the soil and allows it to rest there, making sure there are no air pockets around it, making sure it's going to be touching the moisture. And then we are going to cover it with this dome over here that comes with these trays, and this dome is going to keep the moisture regulated inside the cell trays and allow these seedlings to germinate. Again, it's very important to remember that once these seeds are planted, you should not let them dry out. You can, if you want, bottom water them, but you want to make sure that there's not going to be too much moisture in there that the seeds are going to be sitting in, because that will invite mold, mildew, and also it might rot your seeds. I would suggest to mist them from the top to make sure that the seeds are still moist, that they will not dry out. And then another very important thing to do is that once your seedlings germinate, as soon as you see any germination, you want to take this dome off. And the reason for that is lavender does not like humidity, and this dome is going to create humidity. If you keep this dome on your plants, what's going to happen is that you're going to start seeing your plants rotting one by one, and you are going to regret that you have done that. Ask me how I know. So it's very important that as soon as you see any sign of germination, that you get this dome off your plants, because they do not like humidity whatsoever. So I'm going to keep this on right now because they haven't germinated yet. And as we have mentioned, that these seeds do require light to germinate. So after planting them, you want to make sure to place them in a location where they are going to receive sunlight. And that sunlight is what's going to help them to germinate. For me, I could just simply place them under my grow lights. I have DIY grow lights in our basement. I also have a video on that, and I will link it for you guys in the description box below. You can check it out. And these lights are going to provide these seedlings with all the light that they need in order to germinate. Now let's talk fertilizing. As I have mentioned earlier, you don't want to use soil that contains fertilizer in it, because lavender does not like a lot of fertilizer. Too much fertilizer can kill your plants. And by choosing a soil that does not have fertilizer, you can control the amount of fertilizer that you are giving your plants. And preferably you want to choose organic fertilizer, because it's going to be a lot easier to regulate the quantity that you are fertilizing your lavender with if you were to use organic fertilizer. When these plants are small, they will require that fertilizer, especially when they are sitting in these cell trays when there's not much nutrients that is being provided for them. The perfect time to start fertilizing your lavender is once you see the first set of true leaves. When a plant first germinates, it creates 2 leaves, and those 2 leaves are not actual true leaves. The leaves after that are going to be your true leaves. Once these true leaves appear, then you can start fertilizing your plants, but you want to fertilize at half strength, not the full strength that you would normally fertilize your indoor plants with. I have right here this organic indoor houseplant fertilizer, and this is by Espoma. I really like this product a lot because I have found it to perform the best for me. So once these get their true leaves, I will be using half strength fertilizer on these plants about once or twice a week. As they grow, I may decrease the amount of fertilizer that I give them depending on how well they are doing. Because I'm growing them indoors, once their roots fill up the cell trays, then I will be potting them up, and I will probably be cutting down the fertilizer to once a month. This way they won't get over fertilized, but they will also continue to receive the nutrients that they need, because when you do have plants in pots and you water them, some of that fertilizer is going to leach out of the soil during the watering process. It's not like it's outside sitting in the soil and all those nutrients are present in that soil for it, and the fertilizer stays in that location. The fertilizer is going to leach through the draining holes out to wherever you dump it into. And that's why it's important to continue to fertilize your plants while they are still indoors. Once you plant them outside and the ground, and then you don't need to fertilize them as much. Once these germinate and put on some growth, you don't want to keep them in the cell trays for too long, because they will be stunted. Their roots are going to suffer. They might get root rot as well if you are bottom watering them. So you want to pot them up into pots that are slightly bigger than them, maybe 3 to 4 inch pots, so that their roots can develop and they will be ready to be planted wherever you want them to be planted. Now, lavender is hardy to zone 5, and hopefully this variety is hardy to all sorts of weather as well. I still have a couple more trays to plant, so let's go ahead and get them planted. I'm going to keep this seed packet over here with this cell tray so that I know to put a label on this cell tray to let me know what variety of lavender this is. we got our lavender planted. One neat thing about lavender is that it helps deter insects and pests. So supposedly deer do not like lavender and because they do not like its scent, and if you plant it next to your plants that the deer might like, that might deter them. We'll see. It's going to be in my flower bed. I don't know if that will deter the deer or not. I have found that they don't necessarily care whether they have a plant that's next to them that they think it smells bad or not. They just will eat whatever they can if they are hungry. But that would be pretty neat if this mass of lavender will actually deter the deer. So I have 72 lavender plants in here to plant next season. I planted one lavender plant per cell, but what you can do is plant 2 to 3 seeds per cell. This way you make sure that you're going to end up with some plants germinating, just in case if you have a lot that did not germinate. Again, the key to germinating lavender is to allow it to go through that cold period. So just put your seed packet in the fridge. Some people actually might put a paper towel that's semi-moist and they put the seeds on it and then they leave the seeds in there, and once the seeds start to germinate, that's when they plant them. I have found that the method that I use works really well, and I haven't seen the reason for doing it the other way. In fact, that might actually kill my seedlings, because for me, when it comes to my time and the way how our life works, is that I'm not sure when I will have the time to get to planting them once they germinate. I might not have the time. So in fact, I'm actually killing my seeds if I use that method. This is a proven method for me. Just stick the whole seed packet into the fridge, even stick it in a Ziploc bag if you want to. That's what I did with these seeds, and they will germinate. I found it to work really well for all my seeds that need stratification. Once your seedlings germinate, if you do have 2 to 3 plants or seedlings in the same tray, you want to thin them, and you're just going to snip the ones that you do not want at the base and leave the ones that you do want standing, and that's going to allow that plant to put on all the growth that it can, and they're not going to overtake each other and fill up the cell with a whole bunch of different roots from different plants. That cell is only going to be only for one plant, and it's going to make that plant a lot healthier. If you have multiple plants growing in the same cell, you're going to want to separate them as soon as possible if you're not planning on thinning them. Once they develop a few true leaves, then you want to try to transplant them very carefully, because those roots are very fragile and you might actually tear those roots up and cause your seedlings to die. And now I have a few weeks to wait so that I can see and smell this wonderful lavender.